One of the greatest political changes of the 20th century was obtaining the vote for women. Behind this accomplishment lay decades of refusals by successive governments.
There'd been a continuous campaign for women's suffrage, at least since 1865. So this was a very long-standing campaign.
For 50 years, women had asked really nicely for the vote. And women asked really nicely again, and they asked really nicely again, and they didn't get the vote.
It was one family who led the fight to force through change: the Pankhursts.
That family symbolically is so important as a figurehead of the whole suffrage movement and well beyond as a symbol of women's rights internationally.
If you're brought up in a family like that, you're either completely turned off any kind of agitation or politics, or you get involved and make your own mark.
They delivered a public campaign, not just of civil disobedience, but engagement and spectacle on a scale that hadn't been seen anywhere since the French Revolution.
Synonymous with acts of militancy and clashes with the law, the two sisters, Christabel and Sylvia, along with their mother Emmeline, led the suffragette movement. Behind this united front lay sorrow, jealousy, and divided loyalty.
Christabel and Emmeline expel Sylvia because she's not following WSPU policy. And I think she felt she was treated very, very badly by her relatives.
The sense that I have is of Christabel marching to her own tune and Sylvia much more aware of those around her.
Their private lives may have been hopelessly shattered, but their legacy remains steadfast. Christabel Pankhurst was born into a progressive political household on the 22nd of September, 1880. Her parents, Richard and Emmeline, were married just 9 months earlier. Both were heavily involved in socialist politics and keen advocates of the women's suffrage movement.
Their father, Richard, was a radical barrister. He was a member of the Liberal Party, but he was always regarded as an extremist, which he was. So he supported things like free state education for children, the abolition of the House of Lords, all sorts of things like that.
His wife was very involved in political campaigning. She too had come from a liberal background. Her parents had introduced her to the ideas of the anti-slavery movement, which was very prominent in Manchester.
This is an era where Manchester is not only Cottonopolis, it's not only the mercantile capital of Britain, it's the intellectual capital. London had the money, but whether it was art, whether it was thinking, whether it was libraries and so on, Manchester was already by that time a place where there was a vibrant, modern, radical culture.
Emmeline and Richard's second daughter, Sylvia, followed in 1882. 2 years after Christabel. 3 more children followed between 1884 and 1889, Francis, Adela, and Henry.
It wasn't exactly a typical upbringing for the time. The Pankhurst children were very much encouraged to think about politics. They were not sent to school until much later on, until they were in their teens. Emmeline Pankhurst didn't want their creativity to be stifled in the school system.
One gets the sense of a tight-knit, very happy family. The picture I would have in my mind's eye is one of a close family, but really interested and outward-looking, and therefore lots of interesting people coming through the doors.
Richard Pankhurst always said to his daughters, if you do not spend your life in the service of others, you will have not been worth the upbringing.
Their father isn't asking them who they want to marry. Their father is asking them what they want to be when they grow up, and he always asks them this question. So this is a very big part of their childhood. So in that sense, they were encouraged to be independent, intelligent women with ideas about what their future could be.
They set up their own newspaper at home, which would report on the comings and goings of the Pankhurst household and the political meetings held there. This radical upbringing would affect them all differently. Christabel was the eldest and arguably more talented. She sailed through these early years and garnered much of the adults' attention. Sylvia, however, felt left out, caught between her dazzling older sister and her younger siblings. She missed the attention of her mother, which caused her to retreat. A move to London in the mid-1880s promised the family a new political horizon, but it would be short-lived.
The Pankhurst family moved mainly because Emmeline believed that her gifted husband would do well as an MP.
He was standing as a radical candidate. He hoped there would be a chance for a Pankhurst to enter Parliament and start to change the way that things operated and to have a more radical voice there. So he wanted to raise such questions as the abolition of the House of Lords, home rule for Ireland, so very, very progressive demands for that time, and of course, women's suffrage.
The dramatic thing that went wrong was the death of Emmeline's youngest child, and the heartache for everybody that followed from that. And economically as well, it wasn't a particularly wise choice in retrospect.
To support her husband's political career, Emmeline had set up a fancy goods store, which soon folded. This increased the family's financial difficulties, and after a bout of ill health for Richard, the Pankhursts were forced to move back to Manchester. It was on their return that all members of the family would be enveloped in the newly formed Independent Labour Party.
The Independent Labour Party emerged out of the desire and the agreement amongst a range of radical organisations that working people should aim for parliamentary representation.
I think the Independent Labour Party also really appeals to the Pankhurst family because this is a much more radical political party than the Liberal Party.
There was a whole culture around the Independent Labour Party. You joined in, you could go cycling, walking, as well as going to meetings.
This social aspect of politics is what first appealed to the eldest Pankhurst sister.
The first engagement with it, really, I think, was around friendship. Christabel was a young adult starting to look at a social world beyond her family, driven by her own interests. And she found amazing role models in some of the young women around her who were beginning to speak up and speak of suffrage issues.
These were a group of younger women who started joining in women's working organisations. These young women saw, in quite a modern way, that this was a broader movement, and they broke away.
Initially, this wasn't something that interested her. This starts to change when she's studying law. This is informed by the limitations that she's coming up against in her own life and the difficulty that she's going to face wanting to practice as a lawyer and being a woman.
But whilst Christabel rapidly thrived in this political movement, Sylvia was pursuing another passion.
Sylvia is presented as the more reflective, thoughtful, emotional of the sisters. Those characteristics, I think, drew her literally into drawing and painting and distancing yourself a bit from the world in order to do that.
She was very much influenced by artists such as William Morris and Walter Crane, who very much connected their artistic endeavours with a political project to transform things for political reform.
You didn't choose between being a mill worker or a feminist activist, and you didn't choose between being an artist at the Royal Academy and a feminist activist. You did both.
In the summer of 1898, tragedy would strike the Pankhurst house. Christabel and Sylvia's father, Richard, died suddenly. Emmeline was left as a lone parent with very little means, but her resourcefulness and determination stopped her from being swallowed by her situation. She threw herself fully into the women's movement, her participation in which would lead to the formation of the Women's Social and Political Union.
The WSPU emerges out of a long story and out of an immediate one. The long story is more than 50 years of campaigning, more than 16,000 petitions.
There's been a continuous campaign for women's suffrage at least since 1865. So this was a very long-standing campaign. There have been lots of organisations created within it.
Women had asked really nicely for the vote and really politely. And they knew the Conservative Party wasn't going to help them. And then the Liberal Party seemed to lose its stomach for it. And women asked really nicely again, and they asked really nicely again, and they didn't get the vote.
And then you have a few moments of catalysing. One of the aspects of that was after Richard dies, Emmeline is left impoverished as the head of a household. The Independent Labour Party gets some money together as fundraising, understanding her precarious economic situation, but Emmeline didn't want to receive that charitable donation. In the end, there was a decision to use the money to build a club, a hall, in honour of Richard Pankhurst.
The family find out that a branch of the Independent Labour Party was using it, and that branch wouldn't allow women to become members. Christabel said to her mother, "Mother, you've let the cause of women's suffrage become effaced." And Emmeline agreed with that. And so on the 10th of October, 1903, Christabel and Emmeline were in their house at 62 Nelson Street, Manchester, and they invited along some local socialist women, and they formed the Women's Social and Political Union.
The suffragette was born, and although determined to change the political climate, none of the founders could have imagined just how world-altering this act would be. The WSPU began on a shoestring budget, with no formal rules or constitution. It was formed at a time when the government of the day had no desire of enfranchising women, and suffrage campaigns before had come to nothing. It had to offer something else. Another energy was needed to be added to women's franchise, and this would rest upon the spirit and determination of the Pankhursts.
The original Women's Social and Political Union involved lots of different political women. Teresa Billington-Greig had been involved in campaigning for equal pay. Annie Kenney had been an active trade unionist in her cotton factory. But the Pankhurst family, obviously, they were the founders of it. They were very charismatic, they had lots of ideas, and by popular acclaim, lots of their ideas were supported and were the ideas that the organisation ran with.
I think that they were quite awe-inspiring figures. Sylvia and Christabel were pretty imperious, I think, personally, and so was Emmeline.
They were tired of all the discussion that had gone on about women's suffrage. It was to be women only. It was not to be affiliated to the socialist movement, and it was to campaign for deeds, not words. That was their slogan.
The slogan was solidified in the actions of Christabel Pankhurst at the Liberal Party conference in the Manchester Free Trade Hall in 1905.
In the early days of the WSPU, Christabel found that no notice was taken of their activities, the newspapers didn't cover the stories, and so she advocated the unladylike method of interrupting a political party meeting. And with her close friend Annie Kenney, prepared this question in advance: will the Liberal government, if voted in, give votes to women?
They prepare a banner, and the banner was going to say, when will the government give women the votes? But that was too long, so they look at how to shorten it, and then they shorten it to votes for women.
They wrote the question on a piece of paper, which was handed up to the speaker, and he still didn't answer it. So then they shouted out this question, interrupting men's political meeting, and as you could imagine what happened, pandemonium broke out.
This was what was described as militancy in 1905, demanding that your question was answered in a political meeting. So in some ways that doesn't seem to us to be very militant, but women's demand to be listened to be answered, was regarded as a militant act.
So they were rushed out of the hall where Christabel deliberately committed the technical offence of spitting at a policeman. And so they were arrested, and in the police court the next day they deliberately chose imprisonment rather than pay a fine. And that act was very, very important because it attracted the attention of the newspapers.
This so-called act of militancy could have been seen to do more for women's suffrage in an instant than the countless petitions which preceded it. For other women's movements of the time, this might not have been their preferred form of action, but the WSPU, in that moment, realised for the first time they had the attention of the press.
In some ways, the press were quite attracted by Christabel Pankhurst. She was intelligent, she was witty, she was attractive, so she was somebody that they wanted to photograph, they wanted to interview, and her tactics mark a difference from the old tactics. But we are talking about the Edwardian press, and we are talking about women being treated as objects and as lesser. So much of the press were happy to indulge in one of the most gross sort of caricatures of women suffragists, describing them as somehow unsexed, as unwomanly, as harridans, as wanting to become like men, and as objects of ridicule.
The other thing that's really, really important, and particularly in terms of the Pankhurst family, is that these women launched their own newspapers. And the organs of the suffragist movement were really, really important. They had an absolutely massive distribution.
The term suffragette was one that was used by the Daily Mail in derision. Suffragettes, little, it was making fun of them, petite, a French et at the end of the word. Emmeline, who loved all things French, was kind of thinking, I actually quite like this, I'm going to stick with this, let's adopt it and let's not let it be taken away from us.
As the suffragette movement gained ground, the bold leadership of Emmeline and Christabel would be called into question. This would lead to divisions within it, and also within the Pankhurst family.
In 1907, the WSPU splits primarily over the issue of dictatorial leadership by Emmeline and a sense by some in the party that this is inappropriate, and if you were championing a democratic cause, that of women having a voice, to have a leader not share decision-making constitutionally within the organisation was worrying to them.
Both Emmeline and Christabel thought that charismatic leadership, which they both had, was the best way to lead the women's movement, because then they could respond quickly to issues that they came up.
From their perception, it was a war, it was a battle, and they were the generals and they were going to issue the orders.
Sylvia tried to persuade her mother not to tear up the Constitution, unsuccessfully, but she was very uncomfortable with these political developments. She didn't feel that this was becoming a movement that was any longer relating to working class women.
Christabel became somebody who Sylvia became very resentful to, because I think she felt that it was Christabel's influence on Emmeline that was driving her out.
Sylvia was left sidelined. She was still an active member of the WSPU, but it was Christabel and Emmeline who would not be turned from their mission. The political climate in Britain had also changed. In 1908, the Liberal Party, led by Herbert Henry Asquith, won a landslide victory. Asquith was a staunch opponent of franchise for women, and the Pankhursts saw that more demonstration would be needed.
If there is a baddie in the story, I can't help feeling it's Asquith. I think he is the dinosaur who slows down the rate of change above all else. There are several votes where most parliamentarians would have voted for women to be enfranchised, and he's the one who stops it from happening.
The Women's Social and Political Union are told by the government that votes for women is not going to be granted because women campaigning for the vote cannot prove that they have mass popular support in the country.
Asquith said, "You've got to show me that women want the vote for me to be sympathetic to a women's suffrage measure.
They organised an enormous campaign to get people down to London on the 21st of June 1908. So this involves women chalking on pavements to tell people about it. It involves at the end of films at the cinema, suffragettes get up at the end and make an announcement about the forthcoming demonstration. There are women leafleting every town centre that you can imagine, leafleting outside railway stations.
The Hyde Park demonstration was one of the most wonderful WSPU processions. Over 42,000 women marched there, and they attracted about 500,000 people in Hyde Park.
It really was one of those fundamental moments where people came from all over the country. There were special trains that were chartered from different parts of the country to bring men and women in. This is a time when men are marching alongside women in vast numbers. It's all part of the same struggle.
The demonstration in Hyde Park was vast and showed the government that equal franchise was an issue that resonated amongst the population. The subsequent fallout would set in motion one of the most brutal aspects in the quest for women's suffrage. The 1908 March on Hyde Park had done nothing to persuade Asquith and the rest of the ruling government to even think about changing the law to allow votes for women.
After the procession, it didn't make any difference to him. He didn't change his mind. He was still strongly anti-women's suffrage. He didn't have a high opinion of women.
This prompts the WSPU to organise a protest outside Parliament at the government's refusal to acknowledge what they'd achieved. And this protest is met with quite extreme police violence. Women are attacked, women are sexually assaulted outside Parliament. And this all happens in the view of Parliament itself. When the women look up, they see the MPs essentially laughing at the women being beaten up and assaulted in the street.
The suffragette said to Mrs. Pankhurst, "What is the point of us campaigning peacefully if we're going to be roughly handled in this way with damage to our bodies? We might as well attack property, and that will lead to a much quicker arrest without less damage to us personally."
On that demonstration, two suffragettes, Mary Lee and Edith New, take a cab the short distance up to Downing Street and throw stones through the windows of number 10, where the Prime Minister lived. So the government's refusal to acknowledge this demonstration, refusal to respond, prompts an escalation in militancy.
As time went on, there's a ratcheting of violence by the state and the suffragettes. The government chucks them out of the meetings, they hold demonstrations outside, they get themselves imprisoned so that there has to be a hearing, and the hearing is covered by the media.
Although the suffragette movement was being reported on, what wasn't being seen was the treatment that they suffered in prison. They looked upon themselves as political prisoners, but were not given the same exposure as others. It was decided direct action was needed.
Like most hunger strikes in British political history, it's a strike not for votes for women. It's a strike demanding that the women who've been arrested and imprisoned are treated as political prisoners. When suffragettes were imprisoned, they were categorised as second or third division prisoners. That meant their actions weren't acknowledged as being politically motivated.
The first hunger striker was Marion Wallace. She refused to eat. I think she hunger struck for about 90 hours and they released her. And this then gave the movement the idea that this might be used as an efficient weapon of struggle.
Emmeline and Christabel could instantly see the impact the hunger strike was having on the suffrage cause. The Liberal government's response was shocking.
The government responded with panic, I think. What do you do with a woman who goes on hunger strike? There's the danger of the backlash from the media if the woman dies in prison. They decided that force feeding would be the appropriate tactic. So we have probably one of the most horrific chapters in British history, the force feeding of women who want a democratic voice by a Liberal government.
The response to hunger striking was state-sanctioned torture. And the torture to which we're referring goes by this very polite term, forcible feeding.
Imagine yourself in prison because of your values of wanting to be counted, your values of wanting a voice. And you know in other cells next to you there are other friends of yours who are in exactly the same position. And you hear this trolley, and you hear it coming, and you know exactly what it is. And it stops, and one of the other cells, before it gets to you, the door opens, and you hear what it's all about. The fact that it happens to others, and that you hear it happen to others, and then to you, and then to more after you, that kind of sense of not just your own pain, but other people's pain as well, is an aspect that you don't see in the single picture that is usually used to portray the events. It happens morning and night, day in, day out, and how sometimes you come to the end of that ordeal and you go back into society and the issue is still not resolved. And guess what? You're arrested because you feel passionately about this, and you're back in prison, and it happens again and again and again.
Hundreds of women were subjected to this torture, including Sylvia. The suffragettes' direct action would often be put on hold as the government would promise a parliamentary discussion or a piece of legislation to further women's franchise. Each time deadlines were due, they were missed, and direct action would begin again, often more radical than the last. To add to the difficulty of running the WSPU, Christabel suddenly fled to Paris, following a raid on the headquarters after another act of militancy.
The authorities stepped in and they arrested the leaders. Well, they didn't find Christabel there because she'd been warned beforehand what was happening. She escaped to France and lived mainly in Paris, and from there she tried to lead the women's movement.
Everybody was in prison. Emmeline was serving one sentence but had just been served papers for another one. Sylvia assumed that Christabel was going to depute her to be the acting leader of the organisation in her absence. This is not what happened.
Sylvia, of course, was very put out about that.
I think Christabel being away and able to continue to direct the movement probably did help. I think it probably was tactically the right thing to do.
People loyal to Christabel and Emmeline travelled over to France, and they were often in disguise. And Christabel would write down her article for that week to go in the Suffragette, and she would give particular orders about what was to be done.
The movement was directed from Paris, and in London the militancy continued, as did the hunger strikes and force feeding. The government were trying to avoid creating a martyr, whilst women pushed themselves to the brink of death. They would routinely be released to recuperate, but this action was seen to be making a mockery of the entire justice system. In April 1913, the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Health Act, or the Cat and Mouse Act, was passed. This allowed the government to recapture a suffragette to finish their sentence once they had recovered. But it was only a matter of weeks after passing this bill that the suffragette movement recorded its first fatality.
Emily Davison was the wild card. She was seen as indisciplined because she would go off on her own missions, as it were.
She found herself in and out of prison throughout this period. She was force-fed incredibly brutally. She was force-fed 49 times. She barricaded herself in her cell on one occasion to stop the prison authorities force-feeding her.
She went to the Derby on the 4th of June 1913, and she tried to pin a card, we think, on the bridle of the King's horse as it came round the corner. And of course, it was a very risky thing to do.
Emily was knocked to the ground and suffered an appalling injury. She died 4 days later, on the 8th of June, 1913.
For the suffragettes, they saw her as a martyr for the women's cause, and the suffragette newspaper portrayed her as dying for women's liberty.
Most importantly, the cine reels captured that moment. So this wasn't just something that happened that nobody could see. This was an event that resulted in the death of a young woman for the cause that she believed in front of thousands of people, and a cine reel that resulted that people could keep watching it.
The effect really reinforced to the public how serious things had got. The suffragettes organised a huge funeral and turned up in white. This attracted a lot of attention to what Emily Wilding Davison had done.
Her death would change everything, though at the time it felt that gaining the vote for women was inching further away. Acts of militancy escalated, and the government still would not move on their stance. The WSPU was fractured and being controlled remotely, and the Pankhurst sisters' relationship was becoming more and more toxic. Sylvia was feeling increasingly alienated, whilst Christabel and Emmeline acted as one. The WSPU was suffering. Christabel remained in exile in France and was increasingly obsessed with attacking socialism. Conversely, Sylvia had been meeting with the working-class women of East London and had set up the East London Federation of the WSPU. It worked within the wider union, but had more concern for social issues. Christabel saw this as a personal attack.
There had been quite a lot of organising in East London among working-class women before Sylvia comes. I guess East London is a very obvious place because there had been this tradition of organising.
Sylvia found that the important place to campaign was in the East End because there were working-class women whose needs were greatest, in her opinion. Moreover, the East End was quite close to Parliament, so you could get large numbers of people coming on the marches and on deputations. So it was both an emotional, practical and strategic decision.
Sylvia Pankhurst very much wanted the suffragette movement here to connect up with the immediate social and economic demands that women in this area had.
The consequences of her setting up originally infuriated Christabel and Emmeline. This was completely against what policy was supposed to be.
The Pankhursts were divided, and this was too much for the movement. The personal tensions which had built up over the years impacted on the once shared political goals. Sylvia was summoned to Paris and told by her mother and sister that she was expelled from the WSPU, along with the members of the East End branch.
Sylvia announced the expulsion in January 1914. They were told by the headquarters, as it was called, which was really Emmeline and Christabel, that they were going in the wrong direction because they wanted to influence people from above, and the East London Federation were trying to do things from below.
Sylvia was very upset about being expelled from the WSPU. She describes Christabel sitting there with this Pomeranian dog seated on her knee, looking very bourgeois. So I think she felt she was treated very, very badly by her relatives.
They literally disowned her. She was publicly repudiated, and it was put in the Suffragette. Sylvia Pankhurst does not represent work or the policy of the WSPU.
Severing family ties was a clear sign that Christabel and Emmeline held complete dominance and were surrounded only by those who were wholly committed to their worldview. Sylvia forged ties with the Labour and Liberal parties. She was a suffragette politicians could deal with. A general election was due by 1915, and it seemed like she was on the verge of agreeing a deal with Lloyd George that he would not join any Liberal administration that was formed if it did not pledge a women's bill. But then crisis in Europe derailed everything. The Great War had begun.
By the time of the outbreak of the war, Christabel and Emmeline had moved away from their early socialist politics. They'd moved towards what we would now think of as the right wing of politics. They supported the war. They were Jingos, and they believed that not to support the war was unpatriotic.
There's nothing like war to divide a women's movement because there are issues around militarism, around feminism, around internationalism. A number of the suffragettes supported Emmeline and Christabel.
Meanwhile, you've got some campaigners and many others continuing to say the vote is really important, we can't afford to stop arguing for this. So the pressure's still on from a number of women's organisations.
The government provide an amnesty for suffragette prisoners. And I think they do that because they realise that to be engaging in what rapidly becomes a world war when there are domestic problems at home is going to obstruct the war effort.
It became clear that there would be no quick resolution to the conflict of the First World War. Casualties soared as the fighting carried on. Christabel was noticeably stepping up her stance and used her public platform to encourage men to sign up to the war effort. Sylvia was horrified. She accused Christabel of abandoning their father's pacifism. Any shred of sibling affection was gone. It was a time of change for women all over the country. As more men were conscripted or killed, the need for labour became acute. It would be women who filled the gaps. It is a common belief that this was the reason why, on the 6th of February 1918, the government passed the Representation of the People Act. This gave the vote to women, but only those over 30 who owned £5 worth of property. The truth is somewhat different.
The British government, I think, has never knowingly granted a reform out of its own benevolence.
The people who got the vote were not those young women who were working in the munition factories. It was entitled, older women. The reason they're the ones who got the vote was because you had a liberal conservative coalition who was fearful of the rise of Labour and didn't want to give the vote to young working class women.
The government feared uprising, and there was a real fear of a Bolshevik-style revolution and uprising as a consequence of the horrors of what had happened during the First World War. All over the world, there is a complete change, in a sense, of the breakdown of the old feudal social order and elites.
At long last, the sex discrimination that women had experienced because they were women, had been broken. And they knew, all the women who had campaigned for the vote, they all knew that once this act had been passed, it would only be a matter of time before all women could vote.
On the 11th of November 1918, the First World War officially ended. And by this time, Christabel was back in the UK and had launched the Women's Party, effectively bringing the curtain down on the WSPU. Its policies were a mix of the conservative and the progressive, but by 1919 it had folded. Christabel had tried to run for election in 1918 but lost. She was upset, but Emmeline was devastated. If the Women's Party moved towards conservatism, Sylvia would take a more radical standpoint.
Sylvia Pankhurst, I think, was really caught up in this tide of radicalism, which develops against the First World War and against the British government. The kind of resistance that the First World War generated as working class people saw they were going to have to pay most of the cost of this war. Sylvia Pankhurst very much identifies with that form of resistance. So she is immensely inspired by the Russian Revolution in 1917. She starts to hope that there can be a similar kind of revolution in Britain.
Sylvia continued to be a political activist and campaigner. She was very disappointed with the failures and compromises of the Labour Party during the wartime coalition. She was welcomed very enthusiastically during the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia.
In 1921, Christabel left the UK and moved to California, where she joined the Second Adventist Ministry and became a preacher. There had always been a religious undercurrent to the imagery and rhetoric of Christabel's vision for the suffrage movement, and she had long been drawn to causes which clearly defined good and evil. Sylvia stayed in East London and moved in with the Italian anarchist Silvio Corio. The couple had a child, Richard, out of wedlock. This angered her mother so much that she never spoke to her again. Emmeline's health declined soon after. On the 14th of June, 1928, Emmeline Pankhurst died, just a month before equal suffrage was achieved.
The death of Emmeline was a formative moment, I am sure, for Christabel, because her mother had been a close companion all her life. For Sylvia, it was a bit more problematic.
Sylvia was, by this point, somewhat estranged from her mother, and that added to Sylvia's pain. Sylvia had recently become a mother herself, and she'd very much wanted her mother to meet her son, Richard.
Emmeline was not particularly healthy at that time in her life. She had undergone 13 imprisonments. She had gone on hunger, thirst and sleep strikes, so her body was very weakened.
Both Christabel and Sylvia will have been devastated by the death of their mother because one was very close and because one had been expelled from that love. I think both of them found the death of Emmeline very difficult.
The funeral of their mother would be the last time these sisters saw each other. Christabel would reside in the US until her death in 1958, whilst Sylvia would end up moving to Ethiopia after taking up the cause of post-war upheavals there. She died in 1960. They had their own lives to lead, and the wounds inflicted upon each other in the past were too deep to heal.
What Sylvia and Christabel have in common, I think, was a sense that individuals can make a difference, that what they do with their lives was important, a passion for making a difference, and for doing the best that they can with their lives.
It's no accident. Sylvia is the red suffragette. She is of the left. She is a socialist. Christabel and Emmeline start out that way, but they end up as big C conservatives. It's really interesting from a feminist historical point of view because it reminds us that feminism is part of broader ideologies and party politics and not separate from it.
The Pankhurst legacy is inspirational for women, and I think the drama of the story of the Women's Social and Political Union captures people's imagination.
The lesson for feminist movement today and for other movements more generally is about the complexity of the issues. And within one family, you have a microcosm of difference. Today, people will talk about intersectionality as that idea that the movement is strongest if you understand the differences amongst yourselves. So those sisters and that family more generally represent a lot of key questions I think we can take into the future.
The Pankhursts are viewed today as the driving force behind the suffrage campaign, but this was not something which could have been done alone. Equal voting rights were gained through the hard work of thousands of other women who made their voices heard, who were subjected to abuse, arrested and tortured over and over again. Without these brave individuals, the movement would not have had the capacity to change the world.